It's so funny when I ask myself, what is it that I'm really so taken with when my visual interests are piqued when it comes to women? And it may not be as simple or as innocent as I would like to believe. So my first crush in life was on the Pink Power Ranger. Sorry to Dr. Umar. To be clear, this was followed by crushes on Lil' Kim in the notorious KIM era and the Bills, happily ever after ever Beyonce. So, not sorry to Dr. Umar, but there is a video coming out on that, and trust me, it's going to be interesting. But anyway, this is more about the images and the ideas of what I was told women were supposed to be without any of that being based in reality, right? Like being a child and already sexually mapping out the female form and how that impact to the young male mind shapes how many adult males think and affects what we think is acceptable when it comes to treatment of certain women, right? So I guess let's get into it. What this is about is me coming to recognize something that resides in between the spaces of I didn't have the language to understand it and I didn't know it was necessarily wrong, right? This is the male gaze, not the male gaze, the male, you get it. Anyway, at the outset, before y'all bash my head in, I understand that heterosexual beings will have attraction to the opposite sex. And, it's natural, right? Even at younger ages. But that's not necessarily what this is. This being the male gaze, right? So anyway, in 1975, Laura Mulvey released a now industry lauded, well, more so by the feminists of the industry, but whatever, industry lauded essay called Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, from which the culture gained the term the male gaze. Basically, the essay, among a plethora of other things, gave language to the objectification of women in cinema, right? So fast forward almost 50 years and the term has become a major part of the cultural lexicon, at least amongst the feminists. Quite frankly, for a term that seems so linguistically straightforward, it's shocking yet sadly understandable that there is so much confusion, misunderstanding, and blatantly willful ignorance around the term, right? In its most simple way, the male gaze works in two forms based on who it's aimed at, right? When focused on women, the male gaze functions to objectify them, right? Making them, in the eyes of that man or boy, little, if anything, more than something to be looked at. Right. The spectator male objectifies the spectated female as if the sole point of her existence is to be gazed upon by him. Internally, the gaze is rationalized by a presumption that the woman feels some sort of fulfillment from the gaze, as if it represents her being chosen by the male gazer, right? But see, when the male gaze is projected at other men, it functions to categorize and characterize those men as figures to either be idolized, aspired to, despised, competed with, or when lacking a sense of gaze at all, to be dismissed altogether. Much of the male gaze that is directed towards other males is based in how effectively the male that is being watched performs manhood, and more specifically, how effectively they are perceived to sexually interact with women. I want to get more into that, but it requires a deeper dive, and I'll make a part 2, I think, to explore that more. But for now, we can think of it as a young boy who sexualizes the Pink Power Ranger while heroicizing the Black Power Ranger. though they have essentially the same function, right? They're both fighting crime or aliens or monsters or whatever they were fighting, but different gazes, right? I'm going to be honest and point the finger at myself first. I am kind of a serial gazer. Right now, I tend to justify that in my mind and attribute it to being a photographer. So in essence, I'm always people watching and observing to find the deeper humanity in things, which is absolutely true. Don't get me wrong. But I also catch myself staring at women that I sexually desire. Often. Mulvey categorizes this as scopiophilia, or the pleasure derived from looking at someone else's body, especially when there's a hint of, for lack of a better word, impropriety to it, right? In other words, our curiosity about the physicality of others is kind of high and is more widespread than we think, right? So don't be all judgy. Inherently, I don't think that's a completely bad thing. Listen, we're human. At the end of the day, we're both visual and sexual creatures, but there is something wrong when that gaze morphs into a more nefarious function and I guess treads across the line of what they call symbolic violence. Okay, I get it. I can hear you from across the screen talking about the nonsense terms and woke terms and whatever. But stick with me, right? It'll make sense. So, symbolic violence is a form of non-physical violence imposed via power differentials, right, between different social groups. In this way, instead of the violence being physical or literal, the violence is symbolic or suggestive, right? So, for example, if your supervisor is constantly employing non-office appropriate language and threats to purposely belittle or degrade you to cause disruptive and destructive effects, this would be acting in symbolic violence. It's also due to the power dynamic that they hold over you, right? So in many cases, what we as men don't realize or don't care to realize is that our gaze is inflicting symbolic violence onto the women that we are staring at. I always say this to my guy friends, right? Imagine a dude unsolicitedly staring at you for a long period of time. How would that make you feel? And then the response kind of tends to be, well, I'm not gay, so. To which I respond, well, maybe she isn't attracted to you either. And the thing is, I truly don't think a lot of men realize that they're causing harm or that they're doing anything wrong, but that is because we're taught that a part of expressing our manhood effectively is acknowledging the female form outwardly. Right? From little kids, we're literally taught that in order to prove how not gay we are, we must perform outward antics in order to clearly show our sexual attraction to women, right? In addition to proving our straightness, we're taught that, quite frankly, women like attention. Why else would they be dressed like that? Obviously, this leads to very dangerous pathways of thinking vis-a-vis, she asked for it. I think the truly dastardly misstep here is depositing into young boys that girls and women solely exist for male usage, right? How this manifests in the male gaze is that a lot of times we look straight past the potential interpersonal connection with women and instead err towards a desire to consume them, right? We literally bypass their humanity and relegate them to being an object of desire and potential conquest. Actually, let me put it this way, which is a little bit more digestible, right? We treat women like the waiter carrying our food, and we treat their sexuality like the plate that the waiter is carrying. At a certain point, we cease to see the waiter, right? And all we care about is consuming the food. And a lot of you know how rude and distasteful and unmannerly you can be when you see the waiter as getting in the way of you enjoying your food, right? Sad to say that some men, too many men, treat women's personalities and humanity like an inconvenient necessity that one has to deal with in order to get to their sexuality, right? This is a product of the male gaze, a constant conditioning of the mind to only see women as sexual assets. And look, I promise I am not trying to be a simp or a nice guy or one of those positive masculinity dudes that are just angling themselves in a better position to smash, right? I promise. I wanted to talk about this because I saw what was almost tantamount to an addiction in me. Seriously, there are times when my thoughts and my eyes begin to sexualize women when there is no calling for it, like absolutely none. And it also does go back to posing as positively masculine to get laid, right? Like imagine being so engulfed in the hypersexualization of women that you can be aware of the existence of the male gaze, yet you still can't pull yourself away from seeing your female counterpart outside of being a sexual conquest, right? How many of these guru type people are like that? It's a problem, guys. It's a problem. And I think that leads to something else that has to be discussed, right? Rejection. Castration anxiety is a Freudian psychoanalytical term to describe the occurrence of boys and men fearing the damage or loss of their genitalia, either literally, emotionally, egotistically, etc., etc., etc. And one of the main reasons that men fear women so much on a subconscious level is that we know that their acceptance or non-acceptance of us can potentially and more than likely impact how our manhood is perceived and made effectual. In essence, women hold the key to whether we are socially emasculated. In fact, according to behavioral expert Patrick Wanis, about 67% of American men between the ages of 18 and 49 agree that, generally speaking, men are more concerned about making good impressions and earning the respect of other men more than women. How crazy is that? And I want you to remember that for part two. The difference between receiving the type of male gaze that a Dan Bilzerian or a Michael B. Jordan does versus being dismissed or ignored by circles of male peers is how women react and respond to us. Think about it. Andrew Tate can get away with saying all sorts of crazy things, mostly for two reasons. Firstly, he is seen as someone of value in the eyes of men, which is why they listen and buy into his message. But what really gives his message credulity is that he embodies someone that can actually attract and effectively engage with the attention of women. Let's be real. If we took all of his words and put them into a body of someone who looks like they wouldn't be able to garner female attention, the respect level amongst fellow men would plummet and the message would go absolutely nowhere, right? This is why platforms like Fresh and Fit surround themselves with women, even though they functionally degrade them once they're there. They do it because it's social proofing, right? It's legitimizing and reifying their ability to assemble women around them at will, which in turn attracts the gaze of men who aspire to be able to do something similar or at least talk to some type of woman at all, right? So you can imagine how much of and this word is a massive undersell, agitation it is for some men to feel like certain women are the impediment to them feeling fully realized in their masculinity, right? This is where a lot of the humbling of women comes in at. We've seen it all before, right? A dude will try to talk to a woman that has piqued his interest. And when that interest isn't reciprocated or it's absolutely declined, the guy seeks to tell the woman how unworthy she is, right? Like, despite him trying to get her attention moments earlier, right? This is called leveling, kind of. What really happens is the insecurity alarms go off in the male mind and triggers self-protection mechanisms, right? So in order to stabilize that masculine ego, we have to convince ourselves that regardless of being rejected, we weren't rejected by someone who matters that much, right? But a lot of times they actually do matter that much to us. So for some, sadly, less controlled men, they exert more of an effort to denigrate and disparage the woman who has left them feeling rejected, dejected, and unworthy of his manhood. And sadly, in way too many cases, this insecurity leads to violence. Not symbolic violence, literal violence. And this is why women feel so uncomfortable with us looking at them. Outside of staring at someone like a piece of meat waiting to be devoured, there is a massive threat of actual, literal violence that presents itself when a woman is propositioned by a man that she's not interested in. And in the minds of many women, there is a symbolic violence that occurs when men who they are not interested in are looking at them, right? Like they might potentially proposition them. It's a sucky position to be in because the threat of that violence, that symbol of that violence is always present. Sometimes even if the man means to project that symbol or not. But I will say this, and the next few things may seem like I'm being a devil's advocate or something adjacent to it, but it's solely for the balance of argument, right? As a guy, I fully understand that my actions and how they are perceived by women are almost always correlated to how attractive I am to them in that moment. And by attractive, I mean physically, financially, conversationally, etc., etc., etc. Whatever the rubric is for the specific individual. This means that I am also fully aware that, as stated earlier, I could totally do something that is perceived as malevolent when someone that is seen as more attractive than me can do something that is the same in action, but they can be looked at as charming, playful, mysterious, intriguingly dangerous, yada, 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 all the things. We know this. So if I lack a certain level of self-awareness or possess a high amount of self-confidence, I could simply be operating on thinking that what I'm doing is acceptable for my level of attractiveness. For example, let's say that I'm a guy who's not horrible looking, but not the paramount of pulchritude. But I grew up in an environment where my certain aesthetic or my personality type or whatever was really appreciated and looked at as extremely attractive. Now, let's say that I enter an area where my look and style is much less attractive, much less appreciated. I'm still most likely going to operate with the same level of confidence that I did in my previous setting, even though now my actions will probably be taken much differently, completely differently. What was once smooth or debonair or manly may be taken as creepy, aggressive, arrogant. What may have been acceptable in one setting, one subset, one group, one environment, may be totally unacceptable in the other. A lot of times, actually quite often, what the male gaze is on our end is an attempt to project confidence, right? In other words, it's a sort of mating call to signal that I possess the level of confidence necessary to be a viable mate for you. I spoke a lot about men fearing women for their ability to reject and socially castrate them. A lot of times, this gaze is used as a way to communicate to women that that man is, one, confident enough to not be afraid, and two, willing to conquer the challenge of trying to connect with whatever woman it is, right? It's proving himself. Granted, words like challenge and unafraid can be seen as socially pugnacious, to say the least. But a lot of times, it isn't meant as a harm to women, but as a sort of flexing thing to women, as well as a reassuring thing to ourselves, right? We also have to factor in that a lot of guys are far removed from having this level of confidence and are more susceptible to having their anxiety overtake them than displaying some sort of thing that's going to pique a woman's interest, right? Or at least that's what they think. So a lot of times what ends up happening is the nice guys, or the guys that tend to be less overtly successful with women, enter this phase of suspended narrative, right? This is kind of like the male gaze, but instead of dissecting women sexually, the gazer enters into this kind of daydream state, right? Think about the part of the movie where the hot girl walks in and everything enters into slow-mo, right? Where he imagines a scenario in which this woman who he likely perceives as out of his league engages with him, right? Here, he isn't necessarily ogling a woman for her parts, but he's fantasizing about intimacy. I know, I get it. It sounds far-fetched, but let me tell you, a lot of times, this is what's happening. And I think that's important to clarify for women, because often the male gaze is categorized as this salivary, insatiable, carnivorous thing, when a percentage of time, that man is running, dating, girlfriend, even wife scenarios in his head, as opposed to, or in addition to, sexual imaginations. I can't speak to which happens more often, but it definitely does happen some of the time. The kind of misstep here is it still sort of dehumanizes her and puts her in a space of an idea as opposed to a living, breathing person who maybe doesn't want to be stared at, right? Which also goes back to the idea that some guys are conditioned to view the utility of women as something solely for their consumption and pleasure, i.e., yes, it may make her uncomfortable that I'm staring at her, but my imagination state is bringing me pleasure. So in part 2, I'm gonna delve a little bit more into how us men use women as a social utility and how the male gaze in the digital age has some pretty alarming effects. next. But for now, I guess ponder on better ways of interacting with women rather than just staring at them. Oh, you know what? Do this. Okay, so take a week to count how many times you stare at a woman that you don't know, right? And then make mental notes on what you're specifically staring at or what's running through your mind while you're staring, right? Like intentionally do this. Is it something as innocent as a dreamscape, or is it something a little bit more diabolical? And then on one of those times where you catch yourself staring, look at the closest man to you, right? And picture him staring at your closest female family member like you stared at that woman for the reason that you stared at that woman. How does that play out in your mind? Anyway, until next time, see you soon. Peace.